Can we ask one final question about the Pequot War in particular? I know this is a huge question, but whatever comments you'd like to make about it, we'd definitely welcome. As to the causes of the Pequot War, the conduct of the war itself. You know, there was an expedition launched by John Endicott from Boston originally, I think in 1636, which went down to Block Island and didn't produce much in the way of a battle or spoils or anything. But the following year, there were Captain Mason and Captain Underhill led certain detachments from New England down to a Pequot or Indian fort at Mystic, and many people were burned to death there, shot, tracked down into Fairfield Swamp, etc. Yeah, and you know, the aftermath of that was kind of all of a sudden the Connecticut River Valley area was open, so to speak, to settlement, and the spoil system was fully underway. You know,
the problem with that was the Pequots didn't live in the Connecticut River Valley. And the Connecticut Valley already had English settlements on it, like Weathersfield and a couple of others. The Dutch had been trading there, where Hartford is now, and even Plymouth Colony had a trading post where Windsor is now in 1633. They knew that it was a direct route from the interior where the furs were coming from. And the people from Dorchester, from Mass Bay Colony, sort of usurped Plymouth's territory in that area and started setting up plantations along the river. Well, apparently there was a conflict between some of the English out there and one of the local native chiefs who complained. And
complained about pressures from all the settlers?
I don't know exactly the situation, and I'm doing as best as my memory can serve, but there was some kind of disagreement between this particular native chief and some English colonists on the river there who had originally come from Mass Bay. And he appealed for help, and he got help. But the basic thing about the Pequots was they were a proud, independent people, as most native peoples were, and they did not want to bow to the imperial attitude of Massachusetts Bay Colony. So they became a target because they had something that the colony wanted, and they were expendable to the colonies. So therefore, Massachusetts Bay and its satellite colony, Connecticut, John Winthrop was the governor of Mass Bay, and John Winthrop Jr. was the governor of Connecticut. Plymouth had nothing to do with this because they were still smarting over the Mass Bay people, kicking them out of the Connecticut River area. So they didn't want anything to do with it. It wasn't their fight. And these people went down there and started aggression against these people based upon some flimsiest excuses. The Block Island expedition under Endicott, that wasn't even Pequot territory. Those people were subject to the Narragansett chiefs.
And in fact, they were never sure what Indian tribes they met down there.
They were simply going down there to punish some supposed murderers of a guy that the English didn't like anyway.
Yeah, Oldham.
Yeah, and on the Connecticut River, it was this John Stone character, whom the English didn't like much anyway, who was murdered not by Pequots, but by Niantics, who were allied to the Pequot. And the Pequots were called to account for all this, saying that they were harboring the fugitives and that the whole nation was going to be punished for the deeds of a few guys. And that was typical English behavior, that if one person committed a crime against the English, then the whole group of native people was called to account for it. And if they had, reversed that justice to the English, there would have been a very big outcry. So using those excuses to go down there and start aggression was what caused the war. And they had alienated the tributary groups away from the Pequots, so the Pequots pretty much had to stand alone as a nation against the English. And the Narragansetts were listening to them, but Roger Williams interrupted the council and reminded the Narragansetts that they had never caused aggression against the English and to stay that way. And so therefore convinced them not to get in the war, which they probably might not have done anyway. But after seeing the aggression that happened to the Pequots and seeing how the colonies supported the Pequot tributary chief Uncas of the Mohegan in eastern Connecticut, and using Uncas as an agent against everybody else because he would do everything the English wanted, it so exasperated Meantonomo that he wanted to stop all this action. He wanted the native people to unite as brothers together as all the English did. The English had forged an alliance, the New England Alliance. Meantonomo was going to forge an Indian alliance to stop the English expansion. Not necessarily to drive them into the sea, but reminding them of what they had in the past, their fields, their corn, their deer, their turkeys, their forests, all these things he reminded them of, and told them if they didn't stop the English, then they would have nothing. They would all starve to death.
Yeah.
So he was appealing to tradition and using his influence among the Montauk of Long Island, the Pequots that were left after the war, even the Mohegans and the Wampanoags and others. He tried to unite the Indians together as Indians against the English and stop the expansion. Maybe not be aggressive toward them, but at least stop them.
Yeah. Now, why do you think he was unsuccessful, though? In
Because
all these other efforts?
he was unsuccessful because the English supported Uncas in a war against Miantinomo, and Uncas captured Miantinomo, turned him over to the English, who recommended that he take him back to his territory and kill him. And they sent along a couple of Englishmen to make sure he did it, because if he didn't do it, they would have taken Miantinomo to Boston, and the English would deal with him there. They wanted to get rid of that man because he was forging an alliance of Indians. He was making the natives realize that they had more in common with each other than they had individually with any English colony, like Paucanockets from Plymouth or Massachusetts and Mass Bay Colony or anything like that.
And how many were dead in the war, the Pequot War? How devastating was that for the Indians?
Oh, I don't really know. The Battle of Mystic was only one massacre. I've heard that 600 or 700 people were killed in the Mystic Massacre, but there were other skirmishes and battles against Pequots, and some of them were driven out to the Hudson Valley and sought refuge amongst the Mohawks, who killed them and sent their heads back to Boston, and others were resettled in their territory on small reservations which still exist today.
And how long did that war go on for?
About a year, I think.
Definitely the last question, but let's just throw our imagination wild and say just for a minute that suppose a place like Marymount had, under whatever circumstances, had become the paradigm for colonial behavior that Plymouth and Boston Bay actually became. Let's say that by some crazy circumstances, Marymount was the most successful place around here, and therefore the most culturally influential. How do you imagine things might have been different today, or even throughout the?
Yeah, that's one of those what-if questions that historians always try to play with, but realize that you really can't, because it is really almost an impossibility that Marymount would have been the paradigm, because of the notion of imperialism that Europeans had, of capitalism demanding resources. They needed more and more. The colonial attitude that still exists today is drawing resources from another country, and Marymount was doing that. They were taking resources from the natives and shipping them back to England. So they weren't really much different from anybody else. They just had a different style. So things probably would have just happened just the way they did. Maybe different names and different battles, but
couldn't you not say though that in a large way, like the style is the thing? I mean, a less exploitative relationship certainly leads to different results than building resentment and.
I don't think it was a less exploitative relationship. I just think it was a different kind of exploitative relationship, because Morton really wasn't any great friend to Indian culture. And he was accused at one time of assaulting Indians with birdshot. So, he had his moments. And, we have most of what we know from Morton from somebody that hated him and from himself. And he is no, great example of morality as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. But I tend to think that the general purposes behind what everybody was doing was pretty much the same. And that he was looking at New England as a list of commodities for England. Just the fact of him being here proves that. And reading his book, just talking about how much he could get for this and that and the other, and the idea of trying to civilize the natives is imperialism. And, he was just part of the whole picture. Not much different from anybody else. The objective was the same. The style may have been different, but the objective was the same.